When I was about 12, my great-uncle John came from Ukraine to visit us in Canada. He had a lot of stories, but this was the one that stood out. In the late 1960s, John was traveling by train from his village to another to visit family. He had to change trains at one point, and was dropped off at what amounted to a platform and a hut in the middle of nowhere. There was no one else at the station, and other than a dirt road that led off into the surrounding woods, there was nothing there. He waited for some time, but no train came. It was winter, and getting colder and darker, and just about the time he started worrying about having a place to stay and some food to eat, an old woman appeared out of the twilight. She asked if he was waiting for such and such a train, and when he said he was, she said it wouldn't be along until the following day. She asked if he needed a bed for the night, and offered him a meal and a room at her place, which she said was about an hour's walk from the station. Lodging with locals was more or less the standard when travelling in this part of the USSR, and Great-Uncle John wasn't looking forward to a hungry night on a cold platform, so he was glad to accept her offer. He took his suitcase, and they set off together down the dark road into the forest. It was more than an hour away, more like 2, and by the time they arrived at the woman's small 2-story house, John was tired and hungry. They went inside, and the woman lit some oil lamps and warmed some borscht for them. It was the first time John was able to see the woman clearly, and he was a bit startled to realize that the old woman was actually a man. Not wanting to pry, and too tired to care, John finished his soup and asked where he would be sleeping. She led him up the stairs to a tiny room with a window that contained a single bed and nothing else. He thanked her, they said goodnight, and she closed the door. Then she locked it, leaving him in the dark. Somewhat creeped out by this, John called to her, but she didn't answer, and he heard nothing. Figuring he would deal with it in the morning, and that she had probably done it by mistake, John set his suitcase down and laid on the bed, deciding to make the best of it and get some sleep. Before he could fall asleep though, he felt the urge to pee, and got out of bed, hoping to find a chamber pot or something he could pee in. He got onto his hands and knees, and began to feel under the bed in the darkness, thinking that's where the pot would be if there was one. Instead, he found a body. Great-Uncle John went right to the window to see if he could exit the room that way. It was nailed shut. He knew that if he remained in the room, he was probably a dead man. But if he broke the window and tried to get out that way, there was a good chance that the old woman, and who knows who else was there, would hear him and come into the room before he could get away. So he did the only thing he could do. He pulled the body from under the bed, heaved it onto the mattress, and covered it with the blanket. Then he got under the bed and waited. Sure enough, about an hour later, he heard footsteps coming slowly up the stairs, and then towards the room. The lock clicked, and the knob turned slowly. In the gloom, John saw someone move towards the bed. He heard several terrific and sickening thuds. The person had bashed the body on the bed with a large crowbar, which they had then dropped on the floor right in front of John. There was silence. Then the person went out of the room, and the door was shut again. The footsteps went down the stairs, and then, once more, silence. John moved out from under the bed, took the crowbar, and was able to slowly pry the window open. He didn't say, but I imagine he was shitting bricks the entire time. When the window was up, he threw his suitcase out, then dove through himself, not caring what was below him, only worried about what was behind. he landed without too much injury and began to run into a field behind the house, towards some lights in the far distance. It turned out to be a highway with some military and transport trucks on it, and John was able to get a ride to another village where he could catch a train. He didn't bother reporting what happened to the authorities, since at that time in the USSR, there was a distinct chance he would be the one who got into trouble. He just thanked God that he escaped, and decided that the next time he traveled to visit relatives, he'd take another way. I was laying in bed one night. It's pitch black, apart from the light creeping under the door from the landing. My mum was actually with me in the same room, as we had only just moved in, and she was sleeping on the floor. I look up, and the door slowly creaks open, and slowly, an old woman peers around the door, looks at me, and goes away. I just thought I was in a nightmare, and turned around real fast and went under the covers, hoping I'd wake up. Then, I will never forget what my mum whispered to me. "Did you just see someone peer around the door?" Safe to say, we didn't sleep a wink that night.
My wife and I have lived in our Chapel Hill, Tennessee farmhouse for over 15 years, and for 14 straight years, nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. Our kids have all moved out. It's just me and the wife in the house now. February of 2019, bizarre things started happening. I woke up in the night to my wife shaking me. She said she heard a noise outside the window. She wanted me to go check. I simply walked over to the window, lifted it up, and had myself a look outside. It was chilly out there, so I didn't want to be looking outside for long, but the coast was clear. I shut the window and assured my wife it was okay, then crawled back into bed. Before we could even fall asleep again, there was a noise that made both of us sit up, a sharp but quick click at the window. My wife is no scaredy cat, but she grabbed my arm, clearly worried. She asked me to take the shotgun out there and see who it was. I told her to relax, and I checked the window one more time. I was shocked to find a small scratch in the glass from the other side. I said, "Honey, look at this," and she came over. She put her hands over her mouth and said, "Oh my." What did it? We didn't have a clue. Must have been some big animal, I figured. The next morning, I went outside to inspect the outside by the window. There were no footprints in the dirt by the side of the house. Nothing strange at all outside, actually. So we move on to the next night. It was a rainy, warmer night for February. My wife and I tucked in under the sheets again, and once again there was a sound that could be heard over the rain outside. It was this scraping type sound, muffled of course because it was coming from outside. The sound seemed to be moving closer to the window, then it stopped. My wife and I, sitting up again, looked at each other, and she didn't even have to tell me to go outside this time. I took the shotgun from under the bed again, put on my raincoat, and ran outside as fast as my old bones would allow. My wife turned on the light in the bedroom, which gave me enough light to see these huge scrapes in the vinyl siding. They looked exactly like claw marks. Then I looked down into the mud that I was standing in, and noticed these big feet marks that stopped right before the window, and then turned back in the direction of the woods. I analyzed the marks the best I could, even though they were quickly washing away from the rain. These didn't look like marks from boots, shoes, or any animal that I knew of. It looked like these huge footmarks with claws on the ends. We don't have black bears where we live. 15 years here and we've never seen one, so this just made no sense. I suddenly felt unsafe being out there, even with the shotgun, so I hurried back inside. I told my wife there's some big animal out there, and that as long as we stayed inside, we were safe. We don't have blinds on our bedroom windows, as we don't need privacy from anyone. No one comes out on the property anyway. All I could do was tell my wife to go to sleep. The next night was where things really took the turn for the worst. I woke up around 3 a.m. My wife was still asleep. I sat up thinking I might have heard something. I realized it was chilly in the room. I looked at the window and it was open, but that wasn't the first thing I noticed. The first thing I noticed was the head leaning through the open window into our bedroom. My best description of the head? Inhuman. From the size and shape. It was bigger, and this had a more conish shape. As for facial features, it was just too dark to see any, and it all happened too quickly. I let out one big scream, the type of scream I hadn't heard leave my own body in decades. I went under the bed for the shotgun, but by then, the thing at the window was already gone. My wife was screaming in reaction to my scream. I ran to the window to slam it shut and twist the lock. I told my wife we're sleeping in our son's old room that night. Believe it or not, this was almost a year ago now, and that creature, whatever it was, has never returned. But for 3 straight days, that thing kept coming back to our window, and on the 3rd night, it was halfway into our bedroom.
My family originally comes from Russia. Here's a tale that's been passed down to me. As you're probably aware, things were harsh for Russians under Stalin's leadership. My granddad was a critic of the Man of Steel, and as a result, he found himself imprisoned in a Siberian gulag for being a so-called enemy of the community. His sentence? 10 years hard labor. For many, this might as well have been a death sentence. Millions died in these camps due to the freezing cold temperatures, rampant disease, lack of food, and just generally being overworked to the point of collapse. My granddad was a hardy fella though. He knew that if he put his mind to it, he'd survive. According to him, life in the camp was brutal. Violence amongst the prisoners was commonplace. They'd compete for warmth, cigarettes, and everything in between. A true friend was hard to come by. Plenty of inmates became informers, just waiting to tell the guards about anything that might land them an extra chunk of bread. During his time at the camp, my granddad saw many people try to escape. Most were shot within the first minute of their attempt. The guards always aimed to kill. If an inmate escaped on their watch, they'd often be stripped of their uniforms and ran the risk of becoming an inmate themselves. Those escapees who managed to avoid getting gunned down rarely made it very far. The cold Siberian weather killed most of those poor bastards off. Their bodies were usually found a few kilometers away from the camp. Running was almost guaranteed suicide. Almost. Each day, my granddad and his fellow inmates spent 12 hours cutting and stacking logs. They were running on barely any food. The more timber you cut, the more food you were given. Inevitably, the weak were starving, and occasionally would steal another inmate's bread. The guards didn't bother to punish anyone who stole food. No, they left that to the other inmates. It was an unwritten rule. Anyone that was caught stealing bread was sentenced to death. The other workers would simply wait for the guards to avert their eyes. Then they'd take their axes, and the thief would end up having an accident. It was a code that all the inmates lived by. So, when my granddad caught a young lad eating some of his bread one day, you can imagine how sickened he felt. He was the only witness, but his word would have been good enough to condemn the boy. Instead, my grandfather decided to show him mercy. The lad was one of his bunkmates, and he wanted to give him a second chance. My granddad decided to keep his mouth shut, but made the boy promise never to steal again. This was going to be his one warning. The boy thanked my grandfather and promised him that he'd never touch anyone else's food as long as he was in the camp. One night, a few months later, my grandfather awoke to find the young man nudging him. He urged my grandfather to follow him out into the yard. Delirious with tiredness and hunger, my grandfather did as the young man asked. The pair of them crept their way to a nearby shelter and watched as a group of guards entered their bunkhouse. As it turns out, several of my grandfather's bunkmates had been planning an escape. When the guards got word of this, they decided to hold the whole bunkhouse responsible. The guards rounded up all 10 men inside and marched them out into the freezing cold tundra in the middle of the night. They never returned to camp. He doesn't know if they froze to death or if they were shot. Whatever the case, my grandfather would have shared in their fate had it not been for the actions of the young man. You see, the young man had become friendly with a few of the guards in an effort to score some extra food. They found him endearing enough to keep alive, so when they heard that some of his bunkmates were planning a breakout, they warned him to stay out of the shack at a certain time. Knowing what they meant, the lad remembered the act of mercy my grandfather had showed him and decided it was time to repay his debt. A life for a life. He may have been a thief, but there was still some honor left in him. Whether you want to call it the butterfly effect, or luck, or coincidence, or whatever, the fact that my grandfather spared that boy is the only reason he survived his time in the gulag. Hell, it's the only reason I even exist in the first place.
"8 Feet Tall," or Hachisa Katsuma, is a Japanese urban legend about a tall woman who abducts children. She's 8 feet tall, wears a long white dress, and makes a sound like po, 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 po. My grandparents lived in Japan. Every summer, my parents would take me there on holiday to visit them. They lived in a small village and they had a large backyard. I loved to play there during the summer. When we arrived, my grandparents also welcomed me with open arms. I was their only grandchild, so they spoiled me. The last time I saw them was this summer when I was 8 years old. As usual, my grandparents booked a flight to Japan, and we drove from the airport to my grandparents' house. They were delighted to see me and had a lot of little presents to give me. My parents wanted to have some time by themselves, so after a few days, they took a trip to another part of Japan, leaving me in the care of my grandmother and grandpa. One day, I was playing out in the backyard. My grandparents were inside the house. It was a hot summer's day and I lay down on the grass to rest. I stared up at the clouds and enjoyed the feeling of the soft rays of the sun and the gentle breeze. Just as I was about to get up, I heard a strange sound. Po. Po, 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 po. I didn't know what it was, and it was hard to figure out where it was coming from. It sounded almost like somebody was making the noise themselves, as if they were just saying po, 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 over and over again in a deep masculine voice. I was looking around, searching for the source of the noise when I suddenly noticed something on top of the tall hedges that enclosed the backyard. I saw a straw hat. It wasn't resting on the hedge, it was behind it. That's where the sound was coming from. Po, po, po. And then, the hat began to move, as if someone was wearing it. The hat stopped at a small gap in the edge, and I could see a face peering through. It was a woman. But the edges were high, almost 8 feet tall. I was surprised at how tall this woman was. I wondered if she was wearing stilts or some sort of huge high-heeled shoes. Then, a split second later, She walked off and the strange noise disappeared with her, fading into the distance. Bewildered, I got up and wandered back into the house. My grandparents were in the kitchen drinking tea. I sat down at the table and, after a while, I told my grandparents what I had seen. They weren't really paying attention to me until I mentioned the distinctive sound. Paw, paw. As soon as I said that, both of them suddenly froze. Grandma's eyes grew wide and she covered her mouth with her hands. Grandpa's face became very serious and he grabbed me by the arm. "This is very important," he said, in an intense voice. "You must tell us exactly. How tall was she?" "As tall as the garden hedge," I replied, beginning to get scared. My grandfather bombarded me with questions. Where was she standing? When did this happen? What did you do? Did she see you? I tried to answer all his questions as best I could. He suddenly rushed out to the hallway and made a phone call. I couldn't hear what he was saying. I looked over at my grandma, and she was trembling. Grandpa came barging back into the room and spoke to my grandmother. "I've got to go for a little while," he said. "You stay here with the child. Don't take your eyes off him for a second." "What's going on, Grandpa?" I cried. He looked at me with a sad expression in his eyes and said, "You've been liked by Hachisakutsama." With that, he hurried out, got into his truck and drove off. I turned to my grandmother and cautiously asked, "Who's Hachisakutsama?" "Don't worry," she replied in a shaky voice. "Grandpa will do something. There's no need for you to worry." As we sat nervously in the kitchen waiting for my grandfather to come back, she explained what was happening. She told me there was a dangerous thing that was haunting the area. They called it Hachisakutsama because of its height. In Japanese, Hachisakutsama means 8 feet tall. It takes on the appearance of an extremely tall woman, and it makes a sound like "ho, ho, ho" in a deep male voice. It appears slightly differently depending on who sees it. Some say it looks like a haggard old woman in a kimono, and others say it is a girl in a white funeral shroud. One thing that never changes is its height and the sound it makes. A long time ago it was captured by monks and they managed to confine it in a ruined building on the outskirts of the village. They trapped it using 4 small religious statues called jizos that they placed at the north, south, east, and west of the ruins, and it wasn't supposed to be able to move from there. Somehow it managed to escape. The last time it appeared was 15 years ago. My grandmother said that anyone who saw 8 feet tall was destined to die within a few days. It all sounded so crazy, I wasn't sure what to believe. When Grandpa came back, there was an old woman with him. She introduced herself as Kei-san and handed me a small crumpled piece of parchment saying, "Here, take this and hold it." Then, she and Grandpa went upstairs to do something. I was left alone in the kitchen with my grandmother again. I needed to go to the toilet. Granny followed me to the bathroom and wouldn't let me shut the door. I was beginning to get really frightened by all of this. After a while, Grandpa and Kei-san took me upstairs and brought me into my bedroom. The windows were covered in newspaper, and lots of ancient runes had been written on them. There were small bowls of salt in all 4 corners of the room, and a small Buddha figure placed at the center of the room on top of a wooden box. There was also a bright blue bucket. "What's the bucket for?" I asked. "That's for your pee and poo," Grandpa replied. Kei-san sat me down on the bed and said, "Soon, the sun will be setting, so listen carefully. You must stay in this room until tomorrow morning. You must not come out under any circumstances until 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. Your grandmother and your grandfather will not speak to you or call you until then. Remember, do not leave the room for any reason until then. I will let your parents know what is going on." She spoke in such a grave tone that all I could do was quietly nod my head. You have to follow Keisan's instructions to the letter, Grandpa told me, and never let go of the parchment she gave you. And if anything happens, pray to Buddha, and make sure you lock this door when you leave. They walked out into the hallway, and after saying goodbye to them, I closed the bedroom door and locked it. I turned on the TV and tried to watch, but I was so nervous, I felt sick to my stomach. Grandma had left me some snacks and rice balls for me, but I couldn't eat them. I felt like I was in prison, and I was very depressed and scared. I lay down on the bed and waited. Before I knew it, I was asleep. When I woke up, it was just after 1 a.m. All of a sudden, I realized that something was tapping on the window. Tap, 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 tap. I felt the blood draining from my face, and my heart skipped a beat. I desperately tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks, or maybe the branches of a tree. I turned up the volume on the TV to drown out the tapping noise. Eventually it stopped altogether. That's when I heard Grandpa calling me. "Are you okay in there?" he asked. "If you're scared, you don't have to stay in there all alone. I can come in and keep you company." I smiled and rushed over to open the door, but then I stopped in my tracks. I had goosebumps all over my body. It sounded like Grandpa's voice, but somehow it was different. I couldn't tell what it was, but I just knew. "What are you doing?" Grandpa asked. "You can open the door now." I glanced to my left, and a chill went down my spine. The salt in the bowls was slowly turning black. I backed away from the door. My whole body was trembling with fear. I fell to my knees in front of the Buddha statue and clutched the piece of parchment tightly in my hand. I started desperately praying for help. "Please save me from Hachisaku-sama," I wailed. Then I heard the voice outside the door. "Po, po, po, po." The tapping on the window started up again. I was overcome by fear, and I crouched there in front of the statue, half crying and half praying for the rest of the night. I felt like it would never end, but eventually it was morning. The salt in all 4 bowls was pitch black. I checked my watch. It was 7:30 a.m. I cautiously opened the door. Grandma and Keisan were standing outside waiting for me. When she saw my face, Grandma burst into tears. "I'm so glad you're still alive," she said. I went downstairs and was surprised to see my father and mother sitting in the kitchen. Grandpa came in and said, "Hurry up, we've got to get going." We went to the front door and there was a large black van waiting in the driveway. Several men from the village were standing around it, pointing at me and whispering, "That's the boy." The van was a 9-seater and they put me in the middle, surrounded by 8 men. Keisan was in the driver's seat. The man on my left looked down at me and said, "You've got yourself in quite a spot of trouble. I know you're probably worried. Just keep your head down and your eyes shut. We can't see it, but you can. Don't open your eyes until we've got you safely out of here." Grandpa drove in front and my dad's car was following behind. When everyone was ready, our little convoy started moving. We were going fairly slow, around 20 kilometers per hour or maybe less. After a while, Keisan said, "This is where it gets hard," and started muttering a prayer under her breath. That was when I heard the voice. "Po, po, po, po." I clutched the parchment Keisan had given me tightly in my hand. I kept my head down, but I peeked outside. I saw a white dress fluttering in the breeze. It was moving along with the van. It was Hachisaku-sama. She was outside the window, but she was keeping pace with us. Then, suddenly she bent down and peered into the van. "No," I gasped. The man beside me shouted, "Close your eyes." I immediately shut my eyes as hard as I could and tightened my grip on the piece of parchment. Then the tapping began. Tap, 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 tap. And the voice became louder. Po, 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 po. There was tapping on the windows all around us. All of the men in the van were startled and on edge, muttering nervously to themselves. They couldn't see 8 feet tall, and they couldn't hear her voice, but they could hear her tapping on the windows. Kei-san started praying louder and louder until she was almost shouting. The tension inside the van was unbearable. After a while, the tapping stopped and the voice disappeared. Kei-san looked back at us and said, "I think we're safe now." All of the men around me breathed a sigh of relief. The van pulled over to the side of the road and the men got out. They transferred me into my dad's car. My mother held me close and tears were running down her cheeks. Grandpa and my father bowed to the men and they went on their way. Kei-san came to the window and asked me to show her the piece of parchment she had given me. When I opened my hand, I saw that it had gone completely black. "I think you will be okay now," she said. "But just be sure, hold on to this for a while." She handed me a new piece of parchment. After that, we drove straight to the airport and Grandpa saw us safely on the plane. When we took off, my parents breathed a sigh of relief. My father told me he had heard about 8 feet tall before. Years ago, his friend had been liked by her. The boy disappeared and was never seen again. My father said there were other people who had been liked by her and lived to tell about it. They all had to leave Japan and settle down in foreign countries. They were never able to go back to their homeland. She always chooses children as her victims. They say it's because children are dependent on their parents and family members. This makes them easier to deceive when she poses as their relatives. He said the men in the van were all blood relatives of mine, and that's why they had been sitting all around me, and why my father and Grandpa had been driving in front and in back. It was all done to try and confuse Hachisaku-sama. It took a while to contact everyone and get them all together, so that's why I had to be confined in that room all night. He told me that one of the little Jizo statues, the ones that were meant to keep her trapped, had been broken, and that's how she escaped. It gave me chills. I was glad when we finally got back home. All of this happened more than 10 years ago. I haven't seen my grandparents since then. I haven't been able so much as to set foot in the country. Afterwards, I could call them every few weeks and talk to them on the phone. Over the years, I tried to convince myself that it was just an urban legend, that everything that happened was just some elaborate prank. But sometimes, I'm not so sure. My grandfather died 2 years ago. When he was sick, he wouldn't allow me to visit him, and he left strict instructions in his will that I wasn't to attend his funeral. It was all very sad. My grandmother called a few days ago. She said that she had been diagnosed with cancer. She missed me terribly and wanted to see me one last time before she died. "Are you sure, Grandma?" I asked. "Is it safe?" "It's been 10 years, she said. All that happened a long time ago. It's all forgotten. You're all grown up now. I'm sure there won't be a problem." But what about Hachisaku-sama?" I asked. For a moment, there was silence on the other end of the phone. Then I heard a deep, masculine voice saying, "Po, po, 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 po."
This happened when I was 15 years old. My best friend Anthony wanted me to come over for the night since his parents would be gone all weekend. I rode my bike over and put it in his backyard before letting myself in through his back door. We played basically every video game he had, from FIFA all the way to Call of Duty, with popcorn and other junk food spilled out all over the floor. As the night progressed, we moved from video games to watching half a movie and getting bored to doing prank calls at close to 10 o'clock. Anthony made a few calls to different pizza places. When it was my turn,
I just dialed a few random numbers in hopes to get someone at their house. On, say, my 4th attempt, I finally reached somebody. A guy with a deep and rough voice picked up, answering with a yeah instead of a hello. Anthony's laughing in the background made me stumble with my words mid-sentence, ultimately cracking up into laughter. I had never done a prank call, so I sucked at it. The guy on the other end was silent. I regained a straight face and tried to continue with the call. It went something like this. Sir, would it be alright if I borrowed one of the wheels from your car? What's your name, kid? My name is Bob. Really? You sure it's not Anthony? It hit me like a brick. I looked up at Anthony, whose face was noticeably full of fear. I hung up the phone, not wanting to be on the line with whoever that was for another second. Anthony, who the hell was that? I asked him. I don't know, he told me. Does your caller ID info display your name or something? No, it shows my dad's name. We hopped on the computer and did some research, trying to figure out how it was possible to get someone's name through their phone number. It didn't make sense how he could get Anthony's name so quickly. He was way too young at the time to be on any of those personal information sharing websites. We ended up asking a question on Yahoo Answers, since no one had a similar experience. The question turned up no answers. I suggested he call his dad, but he said he wasn't supposed to have anybody over for the weekend, so he didn't want to call. We planned on sleeping in the living room, so we just resumed watching the movie that we hadn't finished from earlier. Right after the phone call had left my mind, me and Anthony looked at each other when we heard his front storm door opening, and then the doorknob to the front door began to turn. It only was able to turn about halfway before the lock restricted it. Anthony turned off the TV, and I went over to the window to see who it was. I spread the blinds open. There was a tall guy standing outside. He noticed the blinds moving, and turned to look at me. I practically threw the blinds back into place. Me and Anthony hid in the kitchen, listening for any more noises. We heard the sound of the gate to the backyard opening, as it was right outside the kitchen window. God damn it, I said. I forgot to shut the back door. Anthony urged me to run and shut it. I made it to the hallway leading to his back door, and froze. There was a silhouette standing outside the back door. I don't think he noticed me, but he was surely looking into the house. He opened the door and stepped inside. I tiptoed to the kitchen and motioned for Anthony to follow me upstairs. We made it to his room as quietly as possible, pulling the door shut to avoid making any noise. We crawled under his bed. He had cloth covering the bottom of his bed, so you couldn't see anything under it unless you actually moved the cloth. The doors downstairs all opened, each one getting closer to the stairs. Thumps finally began up the stairs, and he was right outside the door now. The door to the room opened. I could hear Anthony's breathing. It was too loud. Footsteps moved over to the closet, and then the closet opened. I could hear the coat hangers being slid around as the fabric of the jackets and coats rubbed against each other. Footsteps moved over to the bed and stopped. I felt like my heart was about to explode out of my chest. Anthony's breathing was too loud. I had to cover his mouth with my hand. Nothing but silence in the room now. We laid still for so long, I almost thought he wasn't even in the room anymore. I moved my hand away from Anthony's mouth and whispered in his ear, "You think we can make a run for it?" He was about to answer when the most disturbing, memory-haunting scream I'd ever heard filled my ears as Anthony was seemingly dragged out from under the bed. I crawled out and saw him struggling with the man. I desperately looked around for anything to use as a weapon. I settled with the screwdriver sitting on his nightstand. I hurried over to the man and drove the screwdriver into his back. He let go of Anthony as he let out a scream of agony, giving us time to get the hell out of the house. Running onto the road would give away our position too easily. It would take too long to make it to his neighbor's house. We dove for the tree line in the woods and took cover behind a bush, watching the house. The back door opened as the man stepped outside, looking around the backyard. He then looked out to the woods. I felt his eyes pass me as he scanned through the tree line. It seemed that it was too dark for him to see us. Then, he turned his head back in our direction. I ducked behind the bush. "Joe, he's coming." "What?" "Dude, get up, we gotta run." He was right. The man was approaching us fast. How could he have seen us? We ran through the woods with the leaves crunching under us, giving away our position. When Anthony tripped over something, I crouched down with him, hoping we had run far enough. Not even 20 seconds later, oncoming footsteps from the direction we were running from came fast. They slowed down only 2 trees away from us as we lay face down in the leaves. Moments later, the footsteps take off in another direction. We waited until we could no longer hear them and took off back in the direction of the house. While running, over the sound of leaves crushing and my heavy breathing, I could swear I heard leaves crushing from behind us. We made it back to his backyard, into his house, and this time remembering to shut the back door. We were now able to call the police. Anthony stayed on the line with them, while I patrolled the back windows, making sure nobody was out there. It was so dark though, I couldn't see anything. So I did something that seems stupid today. I turned on his backyard lights, and immediately in the distance, over by the woods, I saw him, standing in front of a big tree. He turned off back into the woods and disappeared out of sight. That was the last time me or Anthony ever saw him. I would be lying if I told you we heard the occasional knocks at our windows or something cliche. No, that was it. 5 years have passed and nothing has happened. Do I wonder if it was somehow linked to the prank call? Maybe. Does it make sense? Not really. But yeah, this was the story of how me and my still best friend Anthony almost died during a break-in.